Hey, I'm Chris Allen. I've been meaning to do this video series for some time. The short story is basically I'd like to put out some resources for people that are trying to run, their store championship, maybe a World Open qualifier, or really any other event, and are baffled walking up to a tournament map. How do I know how many rounds to pick? What's the Swiss tournament? Those kind of questions. But I know that the second I start this, the very first question we're going to get is, hey, how about intentional draws? Because they've been in the news a lot lately. So I figured let's start there with a little pilot episode 0 type deal. And that'll give me some ideas of what we can improve to make a more useful video series going forward. So at a high level, let's talk about intentional draws. So intentional draws are players realizing that, hey, I can make the cut to this tournament. Usually, or this is the case. The players can say, hey, if I draw this last round, no matter what happens, I'll make the cut. People tend to not like that. So, if the entire top 8 or 16 of a tournament say, oh, well, we're already the top 16 or top 8, let's just draw and make it into the cut, tends to not be well received. But the main thing to know here is intentional draws aren't actually the root of this problem. They're a symptom. Much like you can't just outlaw car crashes, we have to fix what caused the car crash in the first place. And it's going to sound like I have some vested interest in draws existing here. Not really. I don't really care. But my root care is, there's a lot of people upset, understandably so. And when you're upset about something, it's a finite resource that you can use to get things changed. But if the net outcome of all of the mad is, hey, draws don't exist in the game anymore, we didn't actually solve the problem, right? The next tournament that happens to hit those thresholds is going to happen, and everyone will be mad at the next downstream problem. So I'd rather just go into the specifics rather than sit here and talk about it. So let's take a look at just at a high level basic tournament structure. It's going to be necessary for this. I'm kind of assuming some background knowledge here that we're not going to later in the video series. This is why it's episode 0. But I'll try to explain a little bit. So if you've been to a tournament, you've probably seen your more competitive players. Let's make this bigger. You've probably seen your players start drawing charts that are going to look a little something like this. So let's assume we've got 50 players. We're going to play 5 rounds of Swiss. Starting with 50 players at the top. So these 50 players are going to get randomly paired. And after round 1, we're going to, ironically, insert ourselves into a universe really quickly where there are no draws. So the outcome of these games can only be wins and losses. So we're going to have 25 players win and 25 players lose. Cool. In reality, there's 0 or more draws, and those players kind of go into this middle bucket here. So, this might actually be 24 players at 1 win, 24 players at 1 loss, and 2 players at 1 draw. It's going to make our chart really complicated for very little gain, so I'd rather just show you this at the high level. So, cool. This is our standings at the end of round 1. We have 25 players with 1 win, 25 players with 1 loss. Okay, well, what happens next round? All of our players in this 25-player bucket, 1 win, get paired into each other, and 13 of those players will win. And you might say, Chris, 25 over 2 is not 13, to which I would say, you are correct. So what's actually happening here is, 24 of these players are going to get paired into each other, 12 of them will win. There's going to be one game that happens between these two pools. 1, 1, and 0 player will play against 1, 0, and 1 player. We're just going to assume that the player with the higher score is going to win the game, just to make our math easier. In reality, this could be 12 instead of 13. It does actually matter quite a bit, but we have no way of predicting it, so we're just going to assume the more likely thing is going to happen. So 13 players will win that. That leaves us with 24 players playing against 24 players. Turns out 24 of them will win. And then we take a look down here, and we're going to have 13 players again that lost those games. Interestingly, you'll note this is symmetric. That makes some sense. Every round of Swiss, what are we doing? There's 2 possible outcomes to a game. Players are going to kind of walk down this tree, so someone might start out at 0 and 0. They'll win their first game, then lose their next game, then win their next game, win their next game. They can kind of march down the chart. So hopefully that makes some sense. I'm going to fill in the rest of this chart down to the end of round 5 without. Actually, we'll do one more row. Then I'll skip ahead because it can get very tedious very quickly. So 7 players will win this, and then, very similarly, apparently I'm bad at writing charts today. Very similarly there, we have the pair up/down happening. And this math really, truly is as easy as adding these numbers together and dividing by 2, which is, here we have 7. 13 plus 24 is 37, over 2 is 18, because we already put the 1 leftover player here. Same story, this is actually 23 plus 13 is 36. That leaves us with 18 players that won, and then we're going to have 7 players left over from that. So, cool, check. Hopefully that makes some sense. All right, we're going to fast forward. Okay, there we are. Here's our standings after round 5. So you can see we'll have 2 players that have 5 wins, 8 players with 4 wins, 15 players with 3 wins, 15 players with 2 wins, 8 players with 1 win, and 2 players with 0 wins. As you can see, makes some intuitive sense, right? For every 5-0 player, there must be an 0-5 player. For every 4-1 player, there must be a 1-4. Symmetrical. Cool. So let's draw some cuts, because usually our tournament structure is going to be playing some number of Swiss rounds into some cut. So how big should our cut be that we're going to draw for this tournament? We want to have a single elimination bracket after our Swiss cut. Pretty standard format, pretty standard affair. We only have time to play 5 rounds of Swiss on the first day of our tournament. We're going to run a second day for the cut. All very standard stuff. Let's take a look. So top 64 would be literally everyone in the entire tournament. There's no reason to run our Swiss bracket then, so let's not do that. A top 32 is going to be more than half the tournament, 32, 50 of our players. Also, doesn't really pass the small test. Next on the list is a top 16. So, what does that look like? I'm going to use this blue to signify players that are in the cut. So, again, let's just put ourselves in the universe where there is no draw. Cool. So, no matter what happens, our top 2 players are in the cut. So, we'll draw a blue line here to signify that they made it. The next 8 players that are 4-1 also made the cut, because this is only 10 total. Cool. And then somewhere in the middle of this, we pick up 6 players of this 15, the 6 players that are 3-2 that are going to make cut. So that's what our top 16 cut looks like. Okay. Let's briefly add one more line really quickly. How about a top 8? So a top 8, same story. We're going to have the top 2, but then we only get some players from this 6 bucket. But for now, let's continue living in the world of no draws. So there's a pretty intuitive concept. We could call it like a tournament event horizon or something. Once you do sufficiently bad in the tournament, no matter what happens, you can't make the cut. So let's put ourselves in the top 16 universe, just for simplicity's sake, because I want to keep my marker colors consistent. So how bad do we have to do for it to be impossible to make cut? So we can see here, the worst players, the worst standing and Swiss players that will make cut are in this group of 15 that are 3-2. So that means no matter what happens, the 2 and 3 players can't make it, the 1 and 4 players can't, and these can't also. But the interesting thing about our chart is we can track the possible paths that these players could have taken to get here, right? So we can look at here and say, hey, there's no way to get to this 15 from any of these nodes. So let's just draw a quick red line. Everybody to the right of this red line is just eliminated from the tournament. Not as in they can't play, but their games don't matter for determining the cut based on score. Their strength of schedule might be relevant. It might matter, but in terms of the outcome of these games, are not going to impact those players making the cut. What's less intuitive is we can draw a similar blue line, where we can say, hey, no matter what happens, I can't miscut if I do sufficiently well. So here's an example. So here's our 16 players. These 4 players that are 4-0 at the end of round 4, there's no path they can take that takes them out of the guaranteed cut range. So here, as long as they're in these 10 players, they can't miss the cut. So they're going to make the cut here. So we can draw, well, it's kind of a boring line, because here, there's a line of can't miss cut. Interesting. Intuitively you know that. If you go playing a 6-round tournament, and it's a 5-1 cut, and you say to your friend, hey, you're 5-0, congratulations on making cut, you know in your head, hey, wait a minute, that means no matter what happens, he's going to make cut. Their 6th game doesn't really matter. So what actually usually happens in these cases? Let's go back to where draws exist. So I'm going to try to erase this blue line without destroying our chart. It's not going to work very well. Okay, we'll just fill this back in really quickly. Cool. So, in our 5-round tournament, we have a top 16. What actually happens? Well, these 4 players, they know their games don't matter. No matter what happens, they pass the line, the line of making cut. Cool. Okay, so they can intentionally draw. We don't care about any of their games. Something very unfortunate is happening in this Swiss count breakdown too. You'll notice 4 plus 12 is 16. And you can only move up 3 tournament points at a time. So if we draw back in draws, you know, we can move, actually here, we can move these 12 players straight down. And we can move these 4 players straight down. We'll go 1 layer lower just to make this a little clearer. So we have 12 players here, 4 players here. Now, no matter what happens, so this won't be 15 anymore. This will just be 9 players because all of these players get paired into each other, and they all draw. That means these 18 players are playing, and only 9 of them will win. But the interesting thing is we don't care, because this is 16. So no matter what happens, actually, our red line was here the whole time. All these players are eliminated from the tournament, which really means it's an X and 1 cut. So hopefully that makes some sense. Generally, this is a case of intentional draws. You know, the feedback you'll hear from something like this is, wow, you know, intentional draws suck. It made the whole last round of the tournament not matter. Okay, well, how do we prevent that? That's really the question we have here, because intentional draws are nothing more than your tournament telling you that someone's games don't matter anymore. It means that someone is either, or it means that the player is intentionally drawing or past the blue line. So we have a couple things we can do to try to remedy the situation. So option number 1 is the probably simpler one that will make it more intuitive sense to you, is we can add some Swiss rounds to the tournament. So let's skip ahead really quickly. We will fast forward again. I'm going to add a round 6 under this, and we can see what our top 16 looks like. Okay, cool. So let's take a look again. So what's going on here? We have 1 player at 6 wins, 5 players at 5 wins. That's in my own head for a second there. 12 players at 4 wins. That goes past our top 16, so we're not too interested in that. So let's draw our red line again. The red line of thou shalt not pass and still make cut is in a similar place as originally before we started looking at draws. And intuitively makes sense. As soon as you pick up your 3rd loss, you're out of the tournament. But draws can happen. So who's going to draw here? So if you don't know off the top of your head, a draw gets you 1 tournament point, and a win gets you 3, which is to say that we can see that here, each line going down is worth 3 points. So if you're moving down to the left, you're picking up 3 tournament points. So this bucket has 18 points. This bucket has 15. This bucket has 12. And as we look up here, so that means these players already have 15 points, these players have 12, these players have 9. So that means as long as you can get better than 12 tournament points, you've already made cut. So there's some places where we can see that that is already the case if we go up some. So these players, these 2 players that are 5-1, they have 15 points, so their games don't matter. These players with 8 wins, they have 12 points, which means if they intentionally draw, it puts them at 13, which puts them 1 bucket ahead here. Let's go up 1 more level. These 4 players have 12 points as well, which means actually they can just draw twice. There's 4 of them, so A gets paired against B, B gets paired against C, both games draw, and then A gets paired against C or D, and then B gets paired against the other unpaired player, and they can draw again. That puts them at 14 points, which again is past our magic 12 here. So actually, we don't care about the round 4 games. We don't care about the round 5 games from these players either. Okay, well, that's pretty rough. Good news, these players can't draw because they only have 9 points, and 2 draws will get them to 11, which is not past the magic 12. They need to graduate the Swiss. But that is bad news because in terms of trying to minimize intentional draws, because it means that, well, our top 10 players the last round are all going to draw, which means we have, what, 3 games we actually care about? That's pretty rough. So we've kind of solved the problem. We kind of haven't. Here we're going to have 4 intentional draws and then another 5 for a total of 9 intentional draws over the tournament. So, and if we draw our line of making cut, it looks a little something like this. And then, somewhere in here, the people make cut, so I'll just not finish it into that. So how do we fix this? So we can make the tournament deeper. That's what adding Swiss rounds does. But let's try moving the line to the left some. So we'll do some quick erasure again. So fast forwarding. All right, so here we are, 6 rounds again, empty board. So let's look at a top 8 cut. We'll start with our red line again. Who's out of the tournament? 1 player, 6 total, 18 total. That means no matter what, all of these players have no path to get to this bucket, which means they're out of the tournament. Anyone who's to the right of the red line can't make a top 8. Same position it was in before. Interestingly, the upside of having the smaller cut means our blue line gets shifted to the left, which should make some intuitive sense. The further the blue line is to the right, the more players are in the cut. If we make the cut smaller, it has to shift to the left because those are the players that are guaranteed into the cut. So let's take a quick look. So we have 6 players that are in the cut regardless of tiebreakers, assuming there's no draws. So we'll start in that universe again. So we know some games right off the top of our head are irrelevant. So this game, it doesn't matter, right? Our top 2 players are going to be in the top 8 no matter what the outcome of their game is. It's irrelevant. Okay, well, how about our next 8 players? So there are, if you think about it, we have a top 8 cut. There are 6 slots left after these 2 players are in no matter what. So these 8 players can't draw because that will put 2 of them would be at 9th and 10th if they all drew. So they're all kind of forced to stuck playing. And they don't know who those 2 players would be until after the game, so it's in everyone's best interest to play their game now. Okay, cool. So you might say, hey, cool, we got there with just 1 intentional draw. But actually, we need to go up a round because let's look at our points per round again. So again, here we have 18 tournament points if you're undefeated, 15 for 1 loss, and 12 for 2 losses. And we look at that, so that means these 2 players have 15 points, that's why they can just draw. These players have 12, that's why they can't just draw, because now the line of safely making the cut is 15. But how about these players here that have 12 points the round before? Can they just draw? Let's take a look. So, here they have 12 points. If they draw, next round they'll have 13. They'll all get paired into each other again, just like we talked about it before. And then they'll have 14. Interesting. That puts them here, 1 point behind 15, except this 6 players, those 4 players are already included in it for the most part. So no matter what happens, let's actually just erase and draw. This might be a little clearer. So let's assume that our players are perfectly rational creatures, which is not really how things work, but a man can dream. So we have our 4 players here, and actually we need to erase the outcome of these games. So these 4 players at the end of round 4 say, hey, we're all undefeated. I can just draw the rest of my games and make cut. Cool, so they do so. So what does that look like? We're going to start drawing these vertical lines. So now no players will lose a game from this bucket. So this is just going to be a straight line down. So we have 4 players that draw and 0 players that won the game. And I won't even draw the line to the right because it's just going to be confusing because no players from this bucket are here. So now these 12 players are only getting paired into themselves, into their own pool. So there will be 6 of them. Let me clean up this chart a little bit so it's a little easier to read. There we are. So now there's 6 of them. Cool. Interesting. Cool. So these 4 players all just get paired into each other again to 4. And this is going to get a little wonky, so I'll try to make this a little cleaner. My apologies in advance. This is why I don't like drawing draws in charts, because it gets messy quickly. Okay, and then this number is also not 12 anymore because there's a different number of players pooling into them. So from this pool of 6, so these 6 players can only get paired into each other because these 4 will continuously get paired into each other until the next round where they've all played each other and they have to start getting paired down. Actually be one more round after the next round. Anyways, so 3 players will win that game. Sorry about that, technology error. So we'll come back here. So 6 players will lose this from the 9 here, should take us to a total of 15. That's unchanged from before. If we hop over here, 3 players lose those games, plus the 8 winners here is 11. Okay, and we can quickly double check our math, make sure we didn't do anything stupid, because these numbers should add up to 50. 4 plus 3 is 7, plus 11 is 18, plus 14 is 32, plus another 12 is 44, 49, 50. Cool. All our players are still accounted for. And what are their scores? So we already know these players had 12 points, so now they're at 14. Okay. These players had 9 points. They won a game for 3. They won a game for 3. So they earned 6. So actually these players are at 15 points. So this is when I mentioned draws make our chart ugly, because in reality, the winners of this are now over here at 15 points. Cool. And one lucky player, so you'll see we have 3 players at 15 points, 4 players at 14, then our next bucket down is the 12-point bucket. So no draws or anything involved here, so these players have 12. And that means our top 8 cut is the 15-win players, of which there are 3, the 14-win players, of which 14-point players, of which there are 4, and one of our 12-point players. So we have 1. So 1 player will get in with strength of schedule from this pool. And it's funny because that makes this loop all the way back around. So now these 4 players, if they're perfectly rational beings, have to look and say, hey, wait a minute. If we're going to have 1 player that has a whole extra loss over everyone else, I want to play against that player in the top 8, right? And no matter what happens, I'm gonna save some. Just take my word for it. Even if there aren't draws, these 4 players make cut, just based on how tiebreakers work. We'll have a whole extra nice video on why that's the case later. Just for now, take my word for it. So these guys might say, hey, hang on a second. Yeah, I want to play against the weakest player in the top 8. It's not a bye in the top 8, but it's pretty good, right? It's in my best interest to play these games out, which suddenly screws up everyone else's tournament math. It's when these 4 players actually play the game, and all the intentional draws at that point stop. So again, let's. Well, we already showed that scenario, actually, what happens when these players don't draw and play. There start being some draws in the next round. Cool. But now we have our top 8 after 6 rounds. How many intentional draws actually happened here? So here we have 2 intentional draws, and here we have 2 intentional draws. So we have 4 intentional draws, which makes sense because our line of auto-making cut is here, right? The only people that are on the left of it are these 4 players. And just to, let's see, the first question I know is going to come up and says, Chris, this is stupid. I hate intentional draws. These shouldn't happen. Why not just have a graduated cut? Then there wouldn't be any. Just remove draws from the game. The answer is it's complicated. It doesn't work. It's very related to why these 4 players always make cut. But for now, just take my word for it. It's not going to work. I'll make either a follow-up to this, or when we get as far in the main video series, we'll spend some time on it. So hopefully now it's pretty clear what actually causes these draws. These draws happen when the tournament no longer cares about those players' game results. The intentional draws themselves are a symptom. The symptom of, hey, these players already made cut. Their games don't matter, so we don't care. Much like in the same way that the players past this line, we don't care about their results. Players pass the blue line, we don't care about their results. They don't impact anyone else. So how do we prevent intentional draws then? Because obviously we don't want meaningless games in our tournament. That feels bad. So at a high level, we showed option one, which is make the tournament longer, add more Swiss rounds, which works to an extent. But really the bigger solution is having smaller cuts. Because the reason, like let's use the 2023 Last Chance Qualifier for Worlds for an example. When you have 100, I think it was 160 players playing for a top 60, you know, we had something like 40 draws in the last round, right? Why did we have 40 draws? Because it doesn't take that many Swiss rounds to find the top third of your players. Like if we take a look at our Swiss chart here, you'll see here, you know, 25 and 25 is half of 50. 13 is about a third of 50. We could have played 2 Swiss rounds and taken everyone with 2 wins and saved a whole lot of time, that LCQ. But obviously people want to play more rounds, so we were kind of in the boat we were in. Anyways, these big cuts are kind of an X-Wing tradition to have, you know, well, we're going to have all the 4-1s make cut. That's going to be a pretty big cut. We're going to have we're going to do a 6-round tournament. Everyone who's 4-2 or better will make cut. That leads to really big cuts. That's why you get lots of intentional draws, which are what we're presumably trying to avoid here. So how do we fix it? It's not reasonable for us to ask that every tournament organizer know all this math and be able to chart out and pick a round structure. That's ridiculous. So here are the suggested round structures from AMG. So these launched, it feels like yesterday, but it's probably been 6 months, maybe even a year ago. These were not very well received when they came out, to say the least. The round counts are low. The Swiss round counts are low, and the cuts are, I would say, average. At the time, ironically, everyone's complaint was that they were too small. At this point, I think we've been normalized to somewhat more normal Swiss rounds, so they look kind of normal-ish. But you can see it's really designed for a one-day tournament. So if you're trying to run a 2-day World Open qualifier, you can't really do this. You're not going to play 4 rounds of Swiss with 50 players or whatever, right? It's just not a good idea. Everyone's going to leave dissatisfied. So we're not the first people to be having these problems and these structures and everything, not by a long shot. So thankfully, X-Wing games are pretty quick. So we can take a look at some games that have been running for a long time. So Magic, for example, Magic the Gathering, here's their appendix of round timers. And you can see, wow, for this 50 players, what we should do is have a 6-round Swiss with a cut to top 8. Huh, well, they're right. It works well, right? So you can use this as a guide for what you should do for your event. Similarly, Pokemon. You're going to see very similar breakdowns of rounds, almost like it's the same problem they're trying to solve, and it's smart people that have already found the solution. So I would suggest following either of those. Obviously, the larger event counts for these Pokemon. You can't have a 14-round X-Wing Swiss tournament. Worlds is 3 days this year, and it's already, just for Swiss, is 10, which is, compared to everything else, is an insane amount. Thankfully, we don't really have events that big generally, so this is pretty far out of the norm. But you can stick to these 5, 6, 7 rounds and cuts to top 8. And you say, hey, it's really interesting that all of these are cuts to top 8, and it's because cuts to top 8 prevent intentional draws, especially in bigger events. So lastly, I want to drop some tools in here, or second to lastly, I guess I should say. So you can get these charts generated for you. This is a very standard math problem. There's a website called Bradley JX that will generate something that looks like this. And the nice thing is you can give it your player count, and it'll tell you how many rounds you need to have an X and 1 cut where everyone makes cut. You can X and 2, et cetera, with top 8s and top 16s. It'll do all that math for you. And here's a couple other quick things I want to show. So this is what the limitless TCG output looks like. This will tell you, if you give it a tournament format, when your players are going to ID at what point, and you have options for, are my players going to take IDs that are risky? Are my players going to consecutively ID? And then also, Galactic Treasures gives us just a nice quick, hey, I'm thinking of running a tournament with this many players. What might the scores look like? They draw about this often. It just gives you a quick simulation of the output, so you can see if you're happy with where your cut line is going to be. So these 3 are really useful for figuring things out like this. But again, just take what people smarter than us did. There's no reason to be doing all this work manually when you can just follow from the guidelines and get a 98% as good answer that you don't have to worry about the specifics. So hopefully that's pretty clear and makes some sense to you intuitively. I know graduated cuts are going to come up. I know that's the #1 comment of, Chris, this solves all my problems. It doesn't. We'll get to it, promise. I just want to cut this off now because I know I'm already losing some people's attention. So I'm going to post this to Reddit. It's probably where you saw a link to this video. It's probably also the best place to ask questions and get follow-ups. Something to be very curious on is what is easy to understand and what works well. What makes you say, Chris, I don't understand what the hell you're talking about. Slow down. What charts are good, what charts aren't, all that good stuff. So, yeah, post on Reddit. If you put it in the YouTube comments, I'll try to remember to check, but I probably won't, for being realistic. Or if for some reason you don't want to post publicly because of whatever you're going to say, you just want to yell at me, you can DM me on Reddit, and I will receive your yelling. Sounds great. But yeah, thanks for watching. That's everything I have. Hopefully this helps explain at a high level why IDs are not your enemy. They are a symptom of tournament structure problems, and we should fix the tournament structures. And then our ID problem goes away for us, so we don't have to worry about it anymore. Thanks again.